vacancy control. It's not a question of if the government will introduce vacancy control, but when. HST on Airbnbs. In a recent ruling, the Tax Court of Canada determined that properties used primarily as Airbnbs may be subject to HST for the entire sale amount. More tenant rights. This means once you rent out your property, you can't get it back until the tenant decides that they want to leave. A tax on primary residences. If this were to happen, expect to see a flood of inventory in the luxury market if this gains any traction. Rising property taxes. If you own Toronto real estate, expect to see your property tax bill rise a lot in the coming years. The recent increases in capital gains tax. Selling real estate typically triggers a lump sum tax bill. Here are 10 reasons why you should consider selling your Ontario investment property now. Number 10, HST on Airbnbs. In a recent ruling, the Tax Court of Canada determined that properties used primarily as Airbnbs may be subject to HST for the entire sale amount. This happened to an Airbnb operator in Ottawa who continuously rented a condo on a short-term basis for the last 14 months of the 9 years they owned the property and then sold the property. This tells us the CRA is watching the sale of Airbnb properties, and operators need to be careful and get professional tax advice. This ruling will highly discourage short-term rentals, and many of them will become long-term rental properties or be sold. Number 9, bad tenants. As living in Toronto gets more expensive and the Landlord and Tenant Board is backlogged with cases, we'll likely see an increase in delinquent tenants. Expect to hear more stories about tenants not paying rent, forging documents, or just becoming harder to manage. The tough reality is that many landlords are selling their properties and moving their capital to more landlord-friendly provinces like Alberta, or even out of the country to places like the US. This could contribute to rising condo inventory for sale and pressure on prices. Number 8, more tenant rights. Ontario Liberals attempted to pass a bill in March 2024 to not allow evictions in 2025 on the basis of the owner wanting to move back in for personal use, or if the property sells and the new owner wants to move in. This means once you rent out your property, you can't get it back until the tenant decides that they want to leave. They also wanted to freeze rents for 2025. If the Liberals gain power in 2026, there's a real possibility that once you rent out your property, you may never get it back, even if you want to live in it yourself. See, politicians are always looking for ways to win votes, and there are more tenants than landlords, so we could see laws tilt even further in favor of renters. Number 7, vacancy control. It's not a question of if the government will introduce vacancy control, but when. So what is it? It's a policy in the rental housing market that goes a step further beyond traditional rent control. See, while regular rent control limits how much landlords can increase rent for current tenants, vacancy control takes it further, capping rent increases even after a tenant moves out. The government recently launched a rental registry for tenants to report how much rent they're paying, and it's just a matter of time that rent limits become tied to the unit itself, not just the tenant. Number 6, another one to keep an eye on, a tax on primary residences. There are proposals being floated to tax primary residences over $1 million. A think tank group called Generation Squeeze advocates for a tax on your primary residence, and Trudeau met with the founder. If this were to happen, expect to see a flood of inventory in the luxury market if this gains any traction. Number 5, rising property taxes. The City of Toronto has relied on development levies and Toronto land transfer taxes to cover the cost for services for years. But as the pre-construction condo market cooled off and the number of transactions dropped, the city may turn to higher property taxes to make up for the lost revenue. If you own Toronto real estate, expect to see your property tax bill rise a lot in the coming years. With governments looking for new ways to generate revenue, property is an easy target. Number 4, immigration policy and foreign student cap. Toronto's real estate market heavily relies on immigration-driven demand, but recent policy changes, including fewer skilled workers and a 10% cap on foreign student permits, are creating uncertainty. Investors near universities like U of T are already seeing weaker rental demand and falling condo prices. Fewer skilled workers and reduced international student numbers mean less demand for housing, potentially leading to an oversupply and downward pressure on property values. These shifts could make Toronto real estate less appealing to investors who rely on steady immigration growth. Number 3, the recent increases in capital gains tax. Unlike other investments where gains could be staggered, selling real estate typically triggers a lump sum tax bill. This lack of flexibility makes real estate a less attractive investment compared to other options, such as stocks where gains can be realized incrementally over time. For many, the potential for lower returns after taxes may tip the scales in favor of other investment vehicles. Number 2, illiquidity of real estate. Selling a tenanted property lowers its value. Tenants make it hard to schedule showings, fail to keep the property in good condition, or even refuse to leave, which can create a legal and logistical headache holding a property hostage. On top of that, many buyers looking for a home to live in aren't interested in tenanted occupied properties, which limits the buyer pool and hurts the resale value. As a result, more landlords are choosing to sell their properties when they're vacant, and buyers see vacant properties as more appealing. And number 1, U.S. stock market appeal. If stocks are booming, real estate investment might seem less attractive. With all the headaches and headwinds for landlords, investors might turn to the stock market for better returns and less hassle. If you're a property seller, this could mean lower demand. I hate to say it, but being a residential landlord in Ontario is not worth the risk. The cash flow is horrible, the consequences of a bad tenant are too severe, and the outlook for appreciation is too low, and the future direction of rights are all in the tenants' favors. Our government doesn't understand that the best way to help tenants is actually to make Ontario a great place to be a landlord, not an awful place to be a landlord. If this was a great for landlord, it could lead to an increasing supply of rental units, resulting in more affordable values for tenants. Instead, making it offer for landlords is going to drive landlords out of the business, decimate supply, and make rentals more unaffordable. My message to residential landlords in Ontario is that they should seriously consider selling their investment properties or avoid Ontario for all these reasons. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you're planning to hold on to your property, don't miss my next video where I'll share tips on how to avoid a bad tenant.